There is a bridge in Delphi, Indiana, long, rusted, quiet. In February sunlight it looks ordinary, the kind of place children might cross on their way home, the kind of place small towns forget to notice. But once this bridge spoke, not in words, but in echoes, in footsteps, in fear. Two girls walked here one afternoon, laughing, their voices lifted above the creek. Hours later the laughter was gone, and the bridge fell silent again. What remained was a recording, a few seconds of breath, and a man's voice saying, "Down the hill." It would become one of the most haunting fragments in American memory. For years, the question circled, who was he? What happened beneath those iron beams? The nation searched for answers, but the bridge kept its secrets. The water moved on. The seasons changed. And yet, something in that silence refused to fade. This is not a story about a monster. It's a story about the people who kept looking when the world stopped caring, about grief that learned how to speak, about a town that lost its innocence and discovered its courage, because every place has a shadow, and sometimes the shadow is where the truth begins. This is Shadow of the Bridge, the Delphi Murders, and the dark side of the American Heartland, a story of memory, of testimony, and of the fragile, stubborn light that refuses to die. It began on an ordinary winter day, the kind that settles over the American Midwest like a grey sheet. February 13th, 2017, Delphi, Indiana. A small town of barely 3,000 souls nestled between empty cornfields and frozen rivers. For most of the year, nothing happened here. The bridge that loomed over Deer Creek, an old iron structure long abandoned by trains, stood as a relic of a quieter time. Teenagers used to climb it for photos, families used to hike the trail for air, and the town itself wore its innocence like a badge. But that Monday afternoon, innocence began to rot into myth. Two friends. Libby, German, 14, bright and curious, and Abigail Abby Williams, 13, quiet but adventurous, had the day off school for a teacher's work day. It was a day for nothing more than friendship, laughter, and maybe a few selfies on the old Monon High Bridge. Around lunchtime, Libby asked her older sister if she could be dropped off near the trail. The weather was cold but clear. Abby joined her, the two girls bundled in hoodies and jackets, carrying a cell phone, chatting like only best friends could. They promised to be back before dinner. The Monon High Bridge stretched across the ravine. Tall, skeletal, creaking with age, a ghost of the railroad era. From its planks you could see the quiet current of Deer Creek and the brown sprawl of leafless trees. It was a place of beauty and danger, and that afternoon it became a trap. At 2:07 p.m., Libby posted a photo to Snapchat. Abby stands on the bridge, hands in her pockets, mid-step across the weathered wood, the sunlight pale and perfect. It was the last image the world would see of her alive. Moments later, someone entered the frame of their day. Around 3:15 p.m., Libby's father arrived to pick them up, parking at the trailhead. The girls weren't there. At first, no one panicked. Teens lose track of time. But as minutes slipped into hours and the grey light of afternoon dissolved into early evening, worry turned to fear. By 5:30, family members were combing the trails, calling their names through the trees. The police were notified at 5:45. Flashlights cut through the darkness as neighbors and volunteers joined the search. The next day, February 14th, Valentine's Day, the bodies of Libby and Abby were found a short distance off the trail, near the creek below the bridge. The details of what had been done to them have never been fully released. What mattered was the horror that had crossed the bridge that day and how it would never leave Delphi again. News spread fast, even faster than grief. Reporters arrived before sunrise. Television trucks lined the town's narrow streets. Headlines called it the Delphi Murders. 2 young girls taken and killed in broad daylight in a place where nothing bad ever happened. It was a story America couldn't stop watching. But this case was different. Because Libby German, in her quiet, unintentional courage, had left behind something no other victim in small-town folklore had ever managed. Proof. On her phone, investigators found a video clip recorded during the final minutes of her life. The image was shaky, the sound muffled, but what it showed chilled even seasoned detectives. A man walking toward them on the bridge, heavy-set, wearing jeans, a blue jacket, and a brown cap. His gait steady, his tone calm but commanding. 3 words, captured forever. Down the hill. It wasn't just a voice. It was a ghost that would haunt the nation. The video went public days later, edited into a few seconds of grainy movement. Police released a still image. The man mid-step on the bridge. His face shadowed, his eyes unreadable. The town that had never known fear now looked at every neighbor, every stranger, with suspicion. Who was he? How could he have done it right here in daylight? The FBI joined the case. State police flooded Delphi. Hundreds of tips poured in. Men who resembled the figure, voices that sounded eerily similar. Sketches were drawn, then redrawn. One showed a man in his 40s or 50s. Later, another sketch depicted someone much younger. Years later, both images would come to represent not confusion, but persistence, the struggle to name a killer when every clue dissolves into fog. For the families of Libby and Abby, time became elastic. Every sunrise brought another interview, another rumor, another promise that justice was close. The bridge itself, once a harmless landmark, turned into an open wound. People came from far away just to stand on its planks and feel the chill of history. They took pictures, laid flowers, whispered prayers. Some said the air still felt charged, as if the forest had memorized the fear that passed through it. For months, then years, the case remained unsolved. The man on the bridge became an icon of America's fascination with evil hiding in plain sight. The predator who walks among us, unnoticed until too late. Podcasts dissected every frame of the footage. Amateur detectives drew maps and theories, and Delphi, that small, unremarkable town, became a symbol for all that is unknowable in the human heart. And then, as silence thickened, a new phase began. The story of Shadow of the Bridge is not only about the crime, but about what happened after, the obsession, the fear, the suspicion that rotted the heart of a community. It's about what happens when a place built on trust becomes a labyrinth of doubt. For Áine, Cain, and Kevin Greenlee, the journalists who would later write this book and host the Murder Sheet podcast, Delphi was not just another crime scene. It was a mirror held up to the American heartland. They came to tell a story not of monsters, but of people, of how tragedy metastasizes, how truth fragments, and how justice can become a myth whispered across generations. The bridge still stands today, rusted, silent, indifferent, and somewhere, under its shadow, the questions still echo. Who crossed it that day? Who followed those girls? Who told them to go down the hill? In the days after the discovery of the bodies, Delphi stopped breathing. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes with grief. It was the silence of disbelief. The old men who gathered for coffee at the town diner spoke in hushed tones. Mothers kept their children home from the trail. The sound of train whistles in the distance suddenly felt wrong. The Monon High Bridge had once been a teenage dare, a harmless adventure spot. Now it was a shrine of horror. Reporters camped at its edges, cameras pointed toward the tree line where police tape fluttered like a wound, refusing to close. Every small-town murder becomes a mirror, reflecting not just a crime, but the illusion that something like this couldn't happen here. For Delphi, that illusion shattered overnight. At first, the town tried to cooperate. Volunteers brought food to investigators, church groups organized vigils, school staff consoled students. But the longer the investigation dragged on, the more the town began to fracture. The killer wasn't a shadowy stranger from another place. Everyone feared he was one of them. Police briefings became the only form of communal prayer. Each press conference brought hope, then disappointment. In the early weeks, detectives promised progress, but behind the scenes they were drowning in information. The clip from Libby's phone was both a miracle and a curse. It gave them an image and a voice, but no clear identity. Investigators had a partial face, a body shape, a few words, and nothing else. There were no fingerprints, no vehicle, no DNA that could be tied to the man in the photo. They released 2 sketches, then changed them, adding confusion to fear. The first showed an older man with a thick jaw and a stern expression. The second, released 2 years later, looked almost like a different person. Younger, clean-shaven, eyes intense but unreadable. Which was real? No one knew. Police insisted both were relevant, that the truth might live somewhere between them. But to a town desperate for certainty, maybe both felt like betrayal. As the case dragged on, Delphi became the center of a strange modern phenomenon: digital grief. Across America, thousands of strangers became amateur detectives. Reddit threads swelled with theories. YouTube channels claimed secret insight. People slowed down the video, isolated the man's gait, compared voices. Some accused neighbors. Others found patterns where none existed. The internet's obsession transformed the town into a crime scene that never slept. And while many online volunteers meant well, their speculation often turned cruel. Names were thrown out recklessly, lives were disrupted, and the families of Libby and Abby had to watch as strangers dissected their tragedy like entertainment. The local police, unprepared for global scrutiny, began to close ranks. They stopped sharing details, fearing leaks. Reporters complained about secrecy. Residents whispered about incompetence. The tension between transparency and protection became a slow poison. Even the investigators themselves, men and women who had seen every kind of human cruelty, began to unravel under the pressure. For Libby's family, every day without an arrest was a day stuck in the same nightmare. Her grandmother, Becky Patty, became the face of grace under pressure. She appeared at every press conference, urging patience, reminding the public that real investigation takes time. "Someone knows," she said often, looking straight into the camera. "Someone saw him. We just need them to come forward." Abby's mother, Anna Williams, echoed her. "We have to believe that good will win." But belief is fragile, especially when confronted with the slow decay of time. A year passed, then 2, then 5. The faces of the 2 girls faded from national news, replaced by new tragedies. But in Delphi, the bridge never lost its shadow. Locals avoided the trail, yet tourists came in morbid pilgrimage. They walked across the planks where Libby had stood and looked out over the trees, searching for meaning in silence. The podcast era was beginning, and with it came new voices determined to keep the case alive. Among them were Áine Cain, a journalist for Insider, and Kevin Greenlee, a defense attorney and podcaster. Together they launched the Murder Sheet, blending meticulous reporting with empathy for victims. They weren't thrill seekers, they were chroniclers. For them, the Delphi murders weren't just a mystery. They were a window into what violence does to the human ecosystem of a small town. When Cain and Greenlee began digging, they found not a single villain, but an entire network of grief, confusion, and secrecy. Law enforcement was divided between state and local jurisdictions. Evidence management was chaotic. Rumors spread that the killer had been interviewed early on, even questioned, then released. Some residents claimed to have seen a man matching the video's figure weeks before the crime. Others were convinced he was from out of state. The case file grew into a mountain of contradictions. And beneath it all, the town's soul began to corrode. People stopped trusting one another. Churches split over gossip. Families moved away. Delphi's main street, once known for small-town kindness, became a corridor of suspicion. Every friendly nod carried the silent question. Could it be you? Meanwhile, detectives chased ghosts. A man in a neighboring county was arrested for possession of child pornography. Maybe him. Another was questioned in a similar case 2 states away by maybe him. Each lead promised closure, then collapsed. Forensic technology advanced, but not fast enough to deliver justice. The FBI used 3D modeling to reconstruct the bridge, to trace possible routes of escape, to understand the killer's timing. They mapped cell tower data, cross-referenced vehicles, interrogated parolees. Still, the same image haunted them, a figure walking calmly toward the camera, his voice low, commanding. Down the hill, there was something chilling in his tone, not rage, not panic, but confidence. Whoever he was, he had done this before, or at least imagined it often enough to make it routine. Investigators wondered. Had he planned this for days, watching the girls' social media, knowing they'd be there? Or had he stumbled upon them by chance, opportunity turning instantly to violence? The forest around the Monon High Bridge became a metaphor for the case itself. Dense, cold, impossible to see through. And yet, somewhere inside that darkness, a single thread of truth waited to be found. For Cain and Greenlee, the more they learned, the less they believed in clear answers. They started to see Delphi as a reflection of the American heartland itself, a place that prides itself on decency but hides unspoken rage beneath politeness, a town where church pews and gun cabinets coexist, where gossip is both currency and poison. The Delphi murders, they realized, were not just about one man's evil. They were about the collective blindness of a community that assumed it was safe. By the 3rd year, the weight of waiting had changed everyone. Investigators aged, reporters burned out, and the families of Libby and Abby carried the unbearable balance of hope and despair. They refused to let the story die. Each anniversary brought a vigil under the bridge, candles trembling in the wind. "We're still here," Becky Patty would say. "We're not giving up." But somewhere out there, perhaps across town, perhaps across the country, someone else was also watching, listening, waiting for the noise to fade, and for 5 long years, it almost did. By the time 2022 arrived, the Delphi case had become legend, half crime, half folklore. The man on the bridge had been turned into an icon of fear. You could buy T-shirts with his silhouette. Podcasts used his phrase "down the hill" as intro music. For people outside Indiana, it was a mystery to solve. For the people who lived there, it was a wound that refused to heal. Every year, the anniversary came with the same ache. No arrest, no answers, no closure. And then, after half a decade of uncertainty, something shifted. The news broke quietly at first, a rumor passing through small-town networks before it reached national headlines. An arrest had been made. His name was Richard Allen, a 50-year-old CVS pharmacy technician who had lived in Delphi for years. Married, employed, unremarkable. He had helped process photos at the local drugstore, chatted with customers, and occasionally visited the very trail where the murders occurred. When the announcement came on October 31st, 2022, 5 years and 8 months after the murders, the disbelief was almost physical. Reporters scrambled. Residents froze. People scrolled through his Facebook page, trying to reconcile the face of an ordinary man with the image burned into their nightmares. The police held a press conference but revealed almost nothing. Superintendent Doug Carter stood at the podium, his voice cracking slightly as he thanked the families for their patience. Behind him, the words, "We have arrested Richard M. Allen," glowed on the screen. That was it. No motive, no timeline, no description of how they got there. The mystery had found its villain, but the story was far from over. Cain and Greenlee, the authors who had spent years documenting every lead, every rumor, watched the news like everyone else. To them, the arrest didn't feel like triumph, it felt like a new question. How had Alan been hiding in plain sight for so long? And why did the case, after years of silence, suddenly move now? As they dug deeper, a more complicated picture began to form. Richard Allen wasn't an outsider. He had lived in Delphi for more than a decade, worked just a few minutes from the crime scene, and even offered to print photos for the families of the victims after the murders. People remembered him as polite, maybe quiet, but never strange. Some recalled seeing him on the bridge trail in years past. To the outside world, he was invisible, the kind of man who disappears into routine. What led police to him remains partly hidden by sealed court documents, but fragments have leaked over time. Investigators revisited old witness statements, re-examined tips, and analyzed phone data with improved technology. A vehicle seen near the trail that day matched Alan's description. He had reportedly admitted being on the trail that afternoon, though he claimed not to have seen the girls. It wasn't enough to convict, but it was enough to reopen the door. When officers arrived at Alan's home in October 2022, they found weapons, clothing, and other items later listed under sealed evidence. Soon after, he was charged with 2 counts of murder. The man who had once been a familiar face at the CVS photo counter was led away in handcuffs. For the first time in years, Delphi exhaled, but only a little. Because even as the arrest made headlines, the questions multiplied. The prosecution argued that Alan was the man in Libby's video. The defense claimed there was no direct evidence linking him to the murders. The clip on the phone was too blurry, the voice too distorted, the forensics inconclusive. The case became a legal storm of secrecy and speculation. Cain and Greenlee attended hearings, read every motion, and spoke to those close to the investigation. What they found wasn't just a trial, it was a reflection of America's uneasy relationship with justice itself. The prosecution wanted to keep documents sealed, citing safety and the risk of tainting the jury pool. The defense accused them of hiding a weak case. Reporters demanded transparency. Meanwhile, the families, who had waited more than 5 years for this moment, were forced to watch the system grind forward at a snail's pace. In the courthouse hallway, Libby's grandmother told a journalist, "We just want the truth, whatever it is." That sentence carried all the exhaustion of a half-decade of heartbreak. When details began to emerge, they shocked even the most hardened true crime followers. Court filings revealed that Alan allegedly confessed to his wife in a spiritual moment, though later claimed the words were taken out of context. Investigators linked an unspent bullet found near the crime scene to a firearm registered to him. The defense called the evidence circumstantial. The prosecution called it the missing link. But the Delphi story had never been just about evidence. It was about faith. Faith in police. Faith in community. Faith that good people could still stand in the face of unimaginable horror. And by 2023, that faith was cracking. The court battle turned surreal. The defense claimed that ritualistic elements at the crime scene suggested the involvement of a larger group, invoking imagery of cults and conspiracies. The prosecution dismissed it as distraction. The courtroom became an echo chamber of theories, each more desperate than the last. Social media exploded again, every new document feeding an army of online sleuths convinced they alone knew the truth. For Delphi residents, the return of national attention was bittersweet. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps. Vans blocked the streets. Once again, their town's name was everywhere, but for the worst reason possible. Some locals refused interviews, tired of the cameras. Others welcomed them, hoping that visibility might finally bring closure. Cain and Greenlee's perspective, sharpened by years of reporting, was more sober. They had come to see Shadow of the Bridge not as the story of one crime, but of a community haunted by its own reflection. Delphi, Áine Cain said in one interview, is America in miniature. We build bridges to connect, but sometimes we forget what shadows they cast. For them, the story wasn't about Richard Allen's guilt or innocence. It was about the cost of obsession. Every person in Delphi had been transformed by the search for a killer. Neighbors turned into suspects, grief turned into endurance. And as the case wound through hearings, delays, and endless legal filings, one truth became painfully clear. Even when a suspect is named, the shadow doesn't lift. When Cain and Greenlee visited the Monon High Bridge again for their book, the place felt both sacred and cursed. Flowers wilted at the base, messages written in chalk, justice for Abby and Libby, faded under the weather. The bridge groaned in the wind, a sound halfway between memory and mourning. Standing there, they understood the strange power of the place. It wasn't just where two girls died, it was where a community's illusion of safety had collapsed. The man accused of crossing that bridge now sat in a cell, awaiting trial. Outside, the people of Delphi waited too, haunted, divided, hoping that somehow the next chapter would finally make sense of the darkness that began on an ordinary February afternoon. By the time Shadow of the Bridge was published, the Delphi Murders had already outgrown the boundaries of a local tragedy. They had become part of the national subconscious, a cautionary tale that stretched far beyond Indiana. Every small town in America that once said it could never happen here now had a bridge of its own. Delphi was no longer just a place on a map. It was an idea, a reminder of how evil seeps into the spaces we mistake for safe. Áine Cain and Kevin Greenlee didn't set out to write a sensational book. They were journalists first, investigators second, and storytellers third. But what they uncovered in Delphi went deeper than police files or forensic evidence. It was the anatomy of fear, how it spreads, how it changes people, how it lingers. In the book, they describe arriving in town years after the murders, expecting a grieving community but finding something more complicated, a place that had learned to live with suspicion as its shadow. At first glance, Delphi looked ordinary. Pickup trucks at the gas station, church bells on Sunday, children playing on the school lawn. But scratch the surface and the veneer of normalcy cracked. The bridge loomed over everything, in conversation, in dreams, in the collective conscience. People who had grown up trusting their neighbors now locked their doors and watched each other differently. Cain and Greenlee realized they were documenting not just a crime, but the unraveling of faith in the small-town myth that had defined America for generations. They called it the dark side of the American heartland. It wasn't just about one killer. It was about the deeper violence of denial, the way communities protect their image even when the truth demands exposure. Delphi wasn't unique. It was a symbol of what happens when the American ideal of decency collides with reality. That danger doesn't always come from strangers, and that evil can look like a man who prints your family photos at CVS. Through dozens of interviews, Cain and Greenlee pieced together a mosaic of voices, police officers, volunteers, teachers, grieving parents. Each had a version of what happened, and each version conflicted with the others. Some swore they had seen suspicious cars that day. Others insisted they hadn't. A few still believed the killer was someone else entirely. Facts blurred into folklore. Memory turned fluid, shaped by trauma. The truth, Cain wrote, was like the creek under the bridge, always moving, always muddy. They also explored how the internet had turned the Delphi case into a modern witch hunt. What began as collective curiosity quickly spiraled into obsession. Ordinary people spent sleepless nights on forums comparing photos, analyzing gait patterns, and accusing innocent men. The search for justice became a game, one where empathy was often the first casualty. Cain described scrolling through comment threads filled with speculation so cruel it felt like another kind of violence. It wasn't just that people wanted answers, she wrote. They wanted to feel like detectives in a story that wasn't theirs. But amid the noise, there were moments of grace. small acts of remembrance that reminded them why the story mattered. A teacher who kept Libby and Abby's photos in her classroom. A retired police officer who still visited the bridge every month, laying down flowers in silence. These gestures, simple and steadfast, became the moral backbone of Shadow of the Bridge. For every voice exploiting the tragedy, there were others who held its weight with care. In one chapter, Greenlee reflects on the power of the bridge itself, how something built for connection became the site of separation. The Mon-on-High Bridge was meant to carry people safely over danger, he writes, but on that February day, it became a passage into darkness. That sentence carries the quiet poetry of the whole book. The bridge as both literal and metaphorical threshold, between innocence and corruption, between known and unknown, between life and death. The authors also grappled with their own role in the story. As true crime journalists, they were both observers and participants, witnesses to a cultural hunger for answers that sometimes bordered on exploitation. There's always a moment, Cain admits, when you wonder if you're documenting grief or feeding it. They tried to walk that line carefully, grounding their work in empathy rather than sensation. To them, Libby and Abby were not case studies but human beings, two girls whose laughter still echoed in the woods if you listened closely enough. By situating Delphi within the larger landscape of American violence, Shadow of the Bridge asks uncomfortable questions. What does it mean to live in a society that turns tragedy into content? Why do people trust the idea of justice more than its practice? And how many bridges, literal or moral, must collapse before we learn that evil rarely arrives from outside, but grows quietly within us? Cain and Greenlee draw parallels to other cases, small towns across America where unsolved murders became folklore, where justice delayed became justice denied. But Delphi, they argue, was different because it revealed a truth people didn't want to face. The monster wasn't hiding in the woods. He was part of the community. As the trial of Richard Allen approached, the book took on a haunting tension. Each court document, each leak, each whisper added a new layer to the story. But even as the legal machine churned forward, the deeper question remained unresolved. Not who did it, but why do we need to know? Cain and Greenlee realized that America's obsession with true crime wasn't just curiosity, it was ritual. In a culture built on individualism, these stories offer a rare form of collective reckoning. They allow people to confront darkness together, to assign it a name, and then to move on, even if the truth remains just out of reach. In their final chapters, the authors describe visiting Delphi one last time before finishing the book. The town was quiet, snow dusting the ground. The bridge stood the same as ever, rusted, skeletal, waiting. They walked its length slowly, feeling the old timbers flex under their weight. Below, the creek moved in lazy circles, reflecting a pale sky. It looked peaceful, Cain wrote, but it wasn't. It never would be again. They left a small bouquet of wildflowers at the edge, the same kind Abby used to collect. It wasn't closure. There's no such thing in stories like this. It was acknowledgement, a way of saying that even in the darkest corners of the Heartland, memory endures. The final line of Shadow of the Bridge lingers like an echo. We cross bridges to reach safety, but sometimes the crossing is the danger itself. When Shadow of the Bridge reached readers, it didn't feel like the end of a story. It felt like the reopening of a wound that America had never quite learned to close. The book didn't deliver a solution or a hero's triumph. It offered something rarer: understanding. For the families of Libby German and Abby Williams, that mattered. They had watched strangers turn their daughters into internet icons and conspiracy fodder. Now, at least, someone had given their humanity back. Áine Cain and Kevin Greenlee never called themselves crusaders. They called themselves witnesses. To write the book, They returned again and again to Delphi, long after the cameras had left, when the only sound on the bridge was wind and the crunch of gravel underfoot. They spoke to people who still refused interviews, people who kept the story buried in their throats because saying it aloud made it real again. Every conversation revealed how grief reshapes time, how in Delphi, February 13, 2017, never truly ended. They found that memory had become geography. The trail where the girls walked was now lined with handmade signs warning of danger, even though the killer was gone. The diner where locals used to meet for breakfast kept 2 tables empty, reserved for the girls. At the high school, a mural of Libby and Abby smiled down on generations of students who had never met them but knew their story by heart. Delphi was living in 2 eras at once, the world before the bridge and the world after. As Cain and Greenlee wrote, they kept returning to one question. Why did this story cut so deep? There were other unsolved murders, other missing girls, other towns that had known horror. But Delphi struck something primal. Maybe because of the video, the eerie fragment of a man walking, a voice saying, "Down the hill." Maybe because of how ordinary the place seemed, how close it felt to home. The bridge was a symbol of every small-town comfort people wanted to believe in, and when it broke, it shattered the illusion of safety that stretched across the entire Heartland. They spoke with investigators, 2 men and women whose faces had grown older since that winter day. Some still believed in Richard Allen's guilt. Others weren't so sure. What united them was exhaustion. One detective told Cain, "Every time I close my eyes, I still see that bridge." Another admitted he sometimes dreamed of Libby and Abby standing on the planks, looking back over their shoulders, smiling, before the frame goes dark. The book's later chapters peel away the layers of the investigation itself, showing how bureaucracy and pride can strangle progress. There were missed tips, misfiled reports, officers too territorial to share information. It wasn't corruption, it was human nature. Delphi didn't just expose the evil of one man, it revealed the fragility of the systems meant to stop him. Cain and Greenlee wrote about it without venom, but with a steady sadness. Justice, they concluded, isn't just delayed by deceit. It's delayed by disbelief, by the refusal to imagine that horror could live next door. As the trial approached, the authors found themselves back in the courtroom. The air was heavy, full of unsaid things. Families sat on one side, press on the other. When the judge entered, the room stood as one, but it felt less like ritual and more like endurance. Everyone had been waiting so long that the act of waiting had become the point. Cain described the moment in her notes. Justice isn't a verdict, it's the effort to keep showing up. Their reporting also turned inward. They questioned their own role in keeping the story alive. True crime journalism walks a knife's edge between empathy and exploitation, between truth-telling and intrusion. Greenlee, a defense attorney by trade, understood the cost of accusation. Cain, a journalist, understood the cost of silence. Together they navigated that tension with humility. "We can't claim ownership of the story," she said. "We can only bear witness." The phrase bearing witness became the emotional core of Shadow of the Bridge. The authors weren't just cataloguing events, they were trying to understand the cultural hunger behind them. Why did millions of people feel connected to this case? Why did so many want to participate in it, even from afar? Perhaps because Delphi reminded them of the thin membrane separating ordinary life from chaos. The bridge was a metaphor for that border. We all cross it every day without realizing how fragile it is. Cain wrote about visiting the families one last time before publication. They met in a quiet living room filled with framed photos and fading news clippings. Becky Patty handed her a small candle in a glass holder decorated with the girl's initials. "Keep this when you write," she said. "It helps to remember who it's really about." Cain kept it burning beside her laptop through the final draft. Sometimes, in the stillness of writing, she swore she could hear the whisper of the creek under the bridge. The more they wrote, the more they understood that the Delphi story was never about closure. It was about endurance. The families didn't need an ending. They needed remembrance. That's what Shadow of the Bridge became, a monument built from sentences instead of stone. When the book came out, the reaction was complex. Critics praised its restraint, its refusal to sensationalize. Readers called it haunting, devastating, necessary. But some accused it of reopening wounds. "Why can't we just move on?" one local asked a reporter. Cain's answer was simple. Because they can't. In their interviews after publication, the authors reflected on how the case had changed them. Greenlee said he no longer looked at strangers the same way. Cain said she no longer looked at silence the same way. "Silence," she told NPR, "isn't empty. It's full of everything unsaid." For Delphi, the book brought something like reckoning. Old wounds reopened, but so did conversations long buried. People began to talk again, not just about the murders, but about what they meant, about fear, safety, and trust. Schools held discussions about online safety. Churches spoke about collective healing. The town started to live again, slowly, carefully. The Monon High Bridge remains closed to the public now, fenced off and weathered. Nature is reclaiming it, the vines crawling up its steel frame, the boards softened by rain. But the shadow it casts still falls across the town. On clear days, the creek below glints like broken glass, beautiful and terrible all at once. For Cain and Greenlee, that image became the final truth of their investigation. The bridge will always stand. The question is whether people will keep crossing it with open eyes. In the final paragraph of Shadow of the Bridge, they write, "The Heartland prides itself on kindness, but kindness cannot replace vigilance. Somewhere between faith and fear lies the truth, and under the bridge it waits." That's how the story ends. Not with a solution, not with closure, but with a reminder. Every town has a bridge, and under every bridge a shadow. Even after Shadow of the Bridge had been released and the press cycle faded, Delphi refused to sink quietly back into obscurity. The story still pulsed through America's cultural bloodstream like an unfinished song. The names of Libby German and Abby Williams became shorthand for innocence interrupted, for the unease beneath the country's wide skies. News crews might have packed up, but the bridge still waited. And with it, the endless question of how a place so ordinary could hold something so terrible. In the months following the publication, Áine Cain and Kevin Greenlee travelled again across the Midwest, speaking at colleges and community centres. They weren't promoting a bestseller. They were answering a question that had followed them since the book began. What do we do with evil once it enters our lives? Their talks were quiet, unpolished. Cain read passages about the investigation's exhaustion. Greenlee explained how systems meant to protect often fail through pride and denial. They showed the audience photographs of the trail, the bridge, the creek. In every picture, the landscape looked harmless, almost beautiful. That contrast was the point. The pair began to notice that after every lecture, people lingered. They wanted to talk about their own towns, their own losses, the things that had gone wrong close to home. Delphi had become a vessel for collective confession. It was as if by speaking the story aloud, others could finally name the darkness that lived quietly in their own neighborhoods. Cain wrote about those conversations in her journal. "People don't come to us for facts anymore," she noted. "They come for permission to feel unsafe and still go on living." That, she realized, was the real legacy of Delphi. It wasn't a solved or unsolved case. It was the way it forced ordinary people to reckon with the fragility of their peace. Back in Indiana, the families of Libby and Abby continued their work in advocacy. They created scholarships in the girls' names, held awareness campaigns about digital safety, and kept organizing the annual L&A Walk for Justice. The event drew people from all over the country. They came not to mourn but to walk together, across new bridges, under new skies, proving that grief, if carried collectively, could turn into something stronger than fear. But for many in Delphi, healing was more complicated. Some locals resented the constant attention, the tourists, the podcasts. Others clung to it, believing that visibility kept the case alive. The town itself had changed. Empty shops were slowly reopening. A small museum added a section dedicated to the investigation. Yet, in every storefront window reflection, the bridge seemed to linger, like a scar across the face of an otherwise gentle place. Cain and Greenlee returned one last time to update their notes for a paperback edition. It was late autumn. The trees were bare, and the air smelled faintly of rust and rain. They walked to the trailhead where the girls had begun their hike years earlier. The new fences around the bridge glinted with frost. On the gate hung dozens of ribbons and letters left by visitors. One read, "You are remembered." Another, "We walk with you still." For a long time, neither author spoke. Then Greenlee said softly, "This is what justice looks like sometimes. Not a verdict, just endurance." Cain nodded. She took a photo not for publication but for herself. "Endurance," she whispered. And memory. The experience changed how both of them saw their profession. True crime reporting, they realized, wasn't about solving mysteries. It was about witnessing humanity at its limits. The job wasn't to expose monsters, but to study what happens when ordinary people face the unimaginable. In Delphi, they had seen kindness and cruelty, faith and fatigue, rumor and redemption, all coexisting in one fragile community. As the years went on, new crimes filled the news cycle, new tragedies demanded outrage. But the Delphi story endured because it was never just about two girls or one killer. It was about the condition of America itself, the loneliness of its small towns, the weight of its silence, the way it turns trauma into folklore. Every time another small community found itself on national television for the worst possible reason, someone inevitably mentioned the bridge in Indiana in that sense. Shadow of the Bridge became both history and warning. Cain and Greenlee had not written a whodunit. They had written a mirror. And in that mirror, America saw its own contradictions, decency and denial, hope and horror, faith and fracture. The Heartland, they wrote, wasn't simply wholesome. It was human, which is to say, capable of everything. The book began to appear on university reading lists for criminology and journalism programs. Professors used it to teach ethics, how to cover tragedy without feeding spectacle, how to speak for victims without stealing their voices. Cain often joined these classes by video call. Her advice was simple: don't write to solve, write to remember. Meanwhile, in Delphi, the families continued to fight through court delays and appeals. Every hearing felt like reopening a wound, but they kept showing up. In the courthouse hallway hung two portraits of Libby and Abby, their faces framed by soft light, smiles captured in the innocence of before. Visitors often stopped to look. Some cried, some whispered prayers, others just stood silently, acknowledging that the space between life and memory is sometimes only a few breaths wide. On the 6th anniversary of the murders, the town gathered again for the vigil. The candles flickered against the cold. Becky Patty spoke briefly, her voice firm despite the years. "We still believe," she said. "Belief is how we keep the bridge standing." When the crowd released lanterns into the night sky, they drifted slowly toward the horizon, their reflections glowing in the dark water below. Cain and Greenlee watched from the back. For the first time, they didn't take notes. They didn't record or analyze. They simply stood there, witnesses among witnesses. The air smelled of wax and winter. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed across the valley, and for a moment, Delphi felt suspended between past and future, between the story that had ended and the one that would never end. In the final pages of the updated edition, Cain wrote, "The bridge still casts its shadow, but now it falls across people who choose to keep walking. That's how you survive the darkness. You carry it forward, not as fear, but as memory. And with that, the story closes the way it began, with two girls crossing an old bridge under a pale February sun. Only now the world that watches them understands the cost of looking away. The release of Shadow of the Bridge didn't just close a chapter in the Delphi story. It reopened a national debate about the very nature of true crime itself. For decades, Americans had consumed tales of murder and mystery as entertainment. Podcasts ranking in the millions of downloads, Netflix documentaries trending for weeks, YouTube creators dissecting every second of police footage. But Áine Cain and Kevin Greenlee's book arrived like a quiet rebuke to that entire industry. It didn't flatter curiosity. It held up a mirror to it. The author's approach was uncomfortably intimate. They refused to let readers distance themselves from the horror. Instead, they forced them to stand on the bridge, to feel the unease in their stomachs, to confront the humanity of victims who could no longer speak. Critics called the book anti-sensationalist, even anti-true crime. Cain called it something simpler, a documentary of empathy. After publication, the two were invited to speak on panels about ethics in storytelling. Journalists, filmmakers, and criminologists asked them the same question again and again. How do you balance truth with compassion? Cain's answer never changed. You tell the story as though the family is listening, because they are. For a time, it seemed as if Shadow of the Bridge had redrawn the boundaries of the genre. Publishers sought out similar works rooted in empathy rather than spectacle. Universities added trauma literacy to their journalism programs. But beyond the world of media, something deeper shifted. The realization that every headline has an echo, that each story of death leaves ripples far beyond the page. Delphi had shown America what happens when a tragedy becomes public property. Cain and Greenlee watched the true crime community wrestle with this reckoning. Some creators adopted new ethical codes, refusing to show crime scene images or use victims' names without family consent. Others doubled down on sensationalism, chasing clicks with lurid speculation. It was a culture war in miniature, between curiosity and conscience, between storytelling and voyeurism. Delphi, once a quiet town in Indiana, had become the battleground for an argument about the soul of a genre. The authors returned to their podcast, The Murder Sheet, not as commentators, but as caretakers. Their tone was quieter now, their questions gentler. They focused on transparency, context, and the humanity of those affected. They invited criminologists, survivors, and even defense attorneys to speak about the unseen cost of obsession. The episodes drew smaller audiences than before, but the listeners who remained were the ones who wanted to understand, not just to know. Cain sometimes said that the real transformation of the Delphi case wasn't in the courtroom, but in the living rooms of the people who followed it. Viewers who once consumed true crime as entertainment began asking harder questions about their own role in the narrative. They started to recognize the line between empathy and intrusion, between justice and curiosity. "We think we watch these stories to feel safe," she wrote in an essay later. "But what we're really doing is trying to prove that evil is elsewhere." Delphi reminded us it's not. Meanwhile, in Delphi, the case continued to wind through legal motions. Richard Allen's trial was delayed repeatedly, caught in procedural disputes and new evidence reviews. Each postponement reopened the wound. Each headline revived speculation. But even through frustration, a strange maturity began to emerge in the public discourse. The families, once besieged by media attention, now received letters of solidarity from strangers who simply promised to remember, not to analyze or accuse, but to remember. Greenlee described this shift as the beginning of a national humility. America, he said, had learned to look at true crime not as a puzzle, but as a mirror. "It's not about who killed," he told one interviewer. "It's about how we live after." The book's influence reached far beyond journalism. In seminars and writing workshops, Shadow of the Bridge was cited as a model of restraint, proof that horror could be conveyed without spectacle. High school teachers used excerpts to discuss empathy in storytelling. Social workers referenced its passages about community trauma. Slowly, the story of Delphi transformed from tragedy into teaching. Yet Cain and Greenlee refused to sanctify it. They insisted the pain remained real, the damage ongoing. People like to talk about healing, Cain said in a later interview, but healing implies an end. What happened in Delphi has no end. It's a wound that teaches you how to walk differently. In their travels, they began to see that Delphi was not unique. In every state, they found echoes, small towns marked by sudden violence, families trapped between grief and the performance of resilience. These communities all spoke the same language, of disbelief, of fatigue, of enduring hope. And everywhere they went, someone mentioned the bridge. "It's strange," Greenlee said. "The bridge has become a metaphor people carry. Everyone has one now." In 2025, the pair returned to the site for the anniversary once more. The air was cold and clean, the trees skeletal against a washed-out sky. The bridge stood unchanged, its iron frame streaked with rust, its wooden planks soft with age. But what surrounded it had evolved. There was now a memorial garden near the trailhead, filled with flowers and photographs. A sign read, "For Libby and Abby, we keep the light." Cain took a deep breath. "It doesn't feel cursed anymore," she said quietly. "Just heavy." They walked the perimeter, careful not to cross the closed section. Each step echoed softly on the frozen ground. Greenlee stopped and looked toward the creek. "It's strange," he murmured, "how something so small can hold so much." She nodded. "That's America." The following week, Cain wrote an op-ed titled "The Ethics of Echoes." In it, she reflected on how stories like Delphi's never truly end. They reverberate, reshaping those who tell them. "Every time we repeat the words 'down the hill,'" she wrote, "we are choosing whether to echo cruelty or courage." The essay went viral. Not because it solved anything, but because it gave language to what so many felt, that remembering is an act of responsibility. As time passed, the bridge became less a site of horror and more a symbol of resilience. Schoolchildren planted flowers along the trail. Volunteers restored nearby paths in honor of the girls. Each action, no matter how small, became a kind of quiet defiance, a refusal to let darkness define the place. And that, Cain realized, was the quiet truth hidden inside shadow of the bridge. The story was never about murder. It was about aftermath, about how people rebuild themselves slowly, imperfectly, beneath the weight of remembering. The last image the authors describe in their reflections is of a candle left burning near the trailhead, its flame flickering against the wind. They don't say who lit it. They don't need to. The implication is clear. Somewhere, someone still believes in light. That is what remains in Delphi. Not the horror, not the headlines, but the hum of endurance. A town still small enough for everyone to know each other's names, still scarred, still hopeful. And somewhere in the distance, the bridge waits. Its shadow, long, its memory, longer. By the time the story of Delphi had fully embedded itself into the national consciousness, it had become more than a case, more than even a tragedy. It was a psychological phenomenon. The murders of Libby German and Abby Williams had forced Americans to look inward, to confront a fear they rarely named, the realization that evil no longer lived far away, in distant cities or shadowy strangers, but next door, in the pharmacy clerk, in the church volunteer, in the man walking calmly along a bridge in broad daylight, Áine, Cain, and Kevin. Greenlee devoted much of Shadow of the Bridge to exploring this psychological undercurrent, not the who or how, but the why. Why did Delphi grip people so fiercely? Why couldn't the country let it go? Why did the image of the bridge, rusted and hollow, echo in so many imaginations long after the details had blurred? The answer, they found, was buried deep in the American psyche. The United States has always clung to the myth of safety and simplicity, the belief that small towns are the last sanctuaries of goodness, untouched by the chaos of the cities. Delphi shattered that myth with surgical precision. It proved that innocence was never geographic. It was psychological. And once innocence is lost, it is never fully recovered. Psychologists who studied the public reaction called it collective hypervigilance. It was as if the entire nation had absorbed the town's paranoia. Families in distant states began locking their doors at dusk. Parents forbade their children from taking solitary walks. True crime podcasts soared in popularity, but underneath the fascination ran a current of dread. People weren't just consuming fear, they were rehearsing it. Cain and Greenlee wrote about this transformation with both tenderness and unease. Every listener who rewinds the audio of that man's voice, Cain observed, is trying to control the uncontrollable. They are searching for safety inside chaos, order inside terror. It was empathy twisted into obsession, an attempt to find comfort in the dissection of someone else's pain. The book's later chapters delve into how trauma, when shared by a whole society, changes the collective rhythm of thought. Delphi's horror rippled outward until it no longer belonged solely to Indiana. It belonged to everyone. It became the modern American campfire story told not to entertain, but to warn. And yet, warnings rarely prevent anything. They only remind us of what we already fear. The image of the Monongahela Bridge became symbolic in art, essays, even film. Painters recreated it as a skeletal monument against blood-red skies. Musicians wrote ballads invoking its shadow as a metaphor for lost innocence. The bridge, once a physical structure, turned into a psychological one, a threshold between ignorance and awareness. To cross it, even metaphorically, was to accept that the world would never again be simple. Cain and Greenlee often reflected on how stories like Delphi's shape a generation's understanding of morality. Greenlee, with his background in law, saw it as proof of systemic vulnerability, that justice, despite all its rituals, is an act of faith. Cain, more poetic, saw it as a meditation on empathy's endurance. "We can't stop looking," she said in an interview, "not because we're morbid, but because we're desperate to understand how people keep walking after they've seen the darkness." The more they spoke publicly about the case, the more they encountered a curious paradox. People wanted hope, but not too much. They wanted justice, but not ambiguity. They wanted the killer to be ordinary enough to fear, but monstrous enough to separate from themselves. What Shadow of the Bridge forced them to confront was the truth that none of these desires could coexist. Evil in Delphi's story wasn't cinematic or distant. It was human, unremarkable, chillingly familiar. One sociologist described Delphi as a rupture in the myth of wholesome America. After the book's release, universities began hosting discussions on what the case revealed about moral geography, how the line between good and evil is drawn not by place, but by imagination. Delphi had shown that the American Heartland, once marketed as the moral center of the nation, was as capable of horror as anywhere else. Cain and Greenlee revisited this theme in the paperback's preface. "The Heartland is not the opposite of darkness," they wrote. "It's where light and darkness share the same house." That line resonated beyond literature. Teachers quoted it. Ministers quoted it. It became a kind of secular psalm, an acknowledgement that decency without awareness is just another kind of blindness. Psychologically, Delphi revealed how a community metabolizes grief when justice remains suspended. When the brain can't find resolution, it invents ritual, vigils, podcasts, online forums, murals. People returned to the same questions, not because they expected new answers, but because repetition itself was soothing. The ritual became the replacement for closure. Cain compared it to prayer, not to heal, but to keep despair at bay. Yet there was danger in this collective mourning too. For some, obsession became identity. Entire online communities formed around the Delphi case, fracturing into tribes of believers and skeptics. Some saw themselves as allies of the victims. Others acted like detectives in a game. Over time, the original grief mutated into performance, empathy becoming spectacle once again. The authors, who had tried so hard to resist that cycle, watched it re-emerge despite everything. Grief, Greenlee wrote, is a slow contagion. If you touch it long enough, it changes you. Still, they didn't condemn the public. They understood that fascination was just fear in disguise. Delphi was never only about murder. It was about the terror of not knowing, the helplessness of realizing that some stories end without resolution. People looked at the man on the bridge and saw not a stranger, but the unbearable possibility that anyone could become capable of it. Cain once described it perfectly during a lecture. We call it the dark side of the American heartland, but really, it's just the other side of being human. That sentence, quiet and unassuming, became the book's heartbeat. Over time, Delphi's case grew quieter in the headlines, but it didn't fade. It lived in the vocabulary of those who study fear, in classrooms where journalism students debated ethics, in living rooms where parents warned their children about strangers. The shadow had become woven into the fabric of national caution. When Cain and Greenlee reflected years later, they didn't talk about guilt or innocence, or even the outcome of Richard Allen's trial. They talked about what the story revealed, the fragility of the myths that hold a country together, and the power of truth when spoken gently, without spectacle. Delphi had become an unwelcome but necessary teacher. In the final pages of their reflections, Cain wrote, "The bridge no longer terrifies me. What terrifies me is forgetting what it taught us. That even in the quietest places the darkness hums, waiting for someone to hear it." That line closes not just the book, but the era of innocence it described. Delphi, once a name whispered with fear, had become something else entirely. A symbol of awareness, a reminder that knowing the darkness is not the same as becoming it, that empathy is still a form of resistance, and that memory, even painful memory, is the only bridge strong enough to hold the truth. Years after the murders, years after the press conferences and podcasts, after the book tours and the think pieces, Delphi began to look normal again, or at least it pretended to. The leaves returned to the trees, the trails reopened, and laughter began to return to the schoolyards. But beneath that fragile calm ran a slow and steady current, the same one that had always flowed beneath the bridge. Delphi had learned to live with its ghost. When Áine and Kevin Greenlee revisited the town again in the late spring, they noticed how the silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy, textured, full of memory. The people didn't speak of before and after, as they once had. They spoke in the quiet grammar of endurance. The bridge had become not a symbol of horror, but of survival, a place where the worst had happened, and yet life continued anyway. They met with Libby's grandmother again, in the same house where the walls were lined with photographs. Becky Patty's smile was tired but unbroken. "People think healing is forgetting," she said. "But I don't want to forget. Remembering is how I keep her close." Cain wrote that line in her notebook in silence. In a story full of theories and speculation, it was the one truth no one could dispute. Memory was the only form of justice that time couldn't erode. The authors spent that afternoon walking the trails once more. The path was dotted with signs reminding visitors to respect the site, to stay on marked trails, to move quietly. The sound of the creek below was low and steady, a lullaby for the restless. For the first time, they allowed themselves to stand where the girls had last been seen. There were no ghosts there, just wind and water and the weight of knowing. Cain described the feeling later. The air felt thick, like the world was holding its breath. It wasn't haunted. It was sacred. In that stillness, she began to understand why stories like Delphi never truly end. They are not meant to. They exist to remind us of the balance we live upon, the fragile thread between order and chaos, light and dark, compassion and cruelty. Every bridge is a crossing, and every crossing is a choice. Greenlee, ever the lawyer, saw the symbolism differently. Justice isn't the same as peace, he told her. Sometimes justice just means the story gets told right. That line became the heart of their final reflections. Shadow of the Bridge became something more than a chronicle of a murder case. It became a meditation on how people carry pain and what it means to turn grief into purpose. In the aftermath of its publication, survivors of other crimes reached out to Cain and Greenlee, telling them that for the first time they felt seen without being used. One letter came from a mother in Ohio whose daughter had been murdered years earlier. "You didn't make them martyrs," she wrote. "You made them human again." That, Cain realized, was the quiet revolution of empathy, not loud or triumphant, but steady, unyielding. In the face of cruelty, to remain gentle is a radical act. They included that idea in their talks that followed, that empathy, when practiced deeply, becomes a form of defiance. "The killer wanted silence," Cain said during a lecture in Chicago. "Instead, we gave him witness." That's what justice looks like in the absence of closure. In the courtroom, Richard Allen's trial crept forward. Motions, delays, debates about evidence, it all moved with the sluggish rhythm of bureaucracy. The families attended each session, their faces carved with the patience of those who had already lost everything time could take. When the defense argued that Allen was a scapegoat, Cain and Greenlee didn't weigh in publicly. They knew the truth was rarely clean. Guilt and grief often coexist in ways that the law cannot articulate. To them, the real verdict had already been delivered, not in the courthouse, but in the quiet resilience of a community that refused to be defined by tragedy. Delphi had learned that justice isn't a moment, it's a way of living. One evening, as they left the courthouse, Cain noticed a mural newly painted on a nearby brick wall. It showed two girls holding hands walking toward the bridge under a golden sky. Beneath it were the words, "We remember because they deserved forever." She stood there for a long time, the hum of the town around her fading into silence. Later that night, she wrote in her journal, "When the world moves on, memory stays. It's the heartbeat under the quiet. It's the sound of water under the bridge." As time passed, Delphi's name appeared less frequently in the news. Other tragedies came, as they always do. But for those who had crossed that mental bridge, Delphi remained a compass, a place to return to when the world's noise grew unbearable. Teachers referenced it when discussing empathy. Police officers invoked it in training about community sensitivity. Writers quoted it when warning against the seduction of spectacle. Delphi, in its sorrow, had become a teacher, and in its lessons lay something spiritual. The book's final reflections, written years after the investigation, carried a tone closer to prayer than reportage. Cain and Greenlee described standing on the bridge one last time, at dusk. The sky was soft with orange light, the air filled with the scent of rain. They didn't speak. They didn't photograph. They simply stood still. Some stories, Cain wrote, aren't meant to end. They're meant to echo. The bridge creaked under their feet, the metal groaning softly, like an old memory stirring. Beneath them, the creek shimmered in the fading light, endless and indifferent. The world kept moving. Cars on distant roads, children playing somewhere, life continuing. But in that moment they understood what Delphi had given them. Not an answer, but a truth. The truth that evil does not erase good. That silence can carry testimony. That remembrance is a form of resistance. As they walked away, Cain turned for one last look. The bridge, half in shadow and half in light, seemed to hover between worlds. It looked exactly as it had in the first photo Libby posted that day. Empty, eternal, waiting, and in the faint wind, they could almost hear the echo of footsteps. Not of fear this time, but of memory, because the story of Delphi was never just about what was lost. It was about what survived. By the time Shadow of the Bridge came to its quiet close, the story of Delphi had transformed into something no one expected, not a mystery, not a tragedy, but a meditation. What began as an act of journalism had become an act of remembrance, a slow unspooling of silence into something resembling peace. For Áine, Cain, and Kevin Greenlee, the work was never about finality. It was about presence, the decision to keep showing up, even when the answers stayed hidden. In their final visit to Delphi, the town seemed caught between seasons. The fields shimmered gold with early summer light, the air full of insects and birdsong. Everything was alive again, defiantly alive. And yet, the bridge still stood at the edge of the world like an unfinished sentence. It had been fenced off, weather-beaten but not erased. Grass grew through the cracks in its wooden planks, vines reached up its rusted frame. Nature, indifferent and forgiving, was reclaiming it. Cain and Greenlee stood at the trailhead and watched families walk the path that led toward the bridge. Children laughed. Dogs barked. The horror of the past had softened into a story told carefully, respectfully, as if each word might awaken something sleeping in the soil. For a long moment they said nothing. Then Cain whispered, "This is what it means to outlive a shadow." They left a bouquet of daisies on a stone near the entrance. Simple, quiet, unannounced. It wasn't a gesture for the cameras or the readers. It was for the two girls who had unknowingly changed a nation, for the families who kept believing, for every person who had carried the story in their heart without ever visiting the town. Later, sitting in a small diner downtown, they looked out the window toward the horizon. The same sky stretched endlessly over Delphi that had stretched over every small town in America, a sky that had seen both kindness and cruelty. Greenlee stirred his coffee absently. "Do you ever think we made it too heavy?" he asked. Cain smiled faintly. "No," she said. "We just made it honest." Honesty had been the hardest part. The temptation to simplify the story, to flatten it into good and evil, had followed them every step. But the truth of Delphi was never simple. It was a landscape of contradictions. Faith and failure, horror and humanity, grief and grace. In giving that complexity a voice, Shadow of the Bridge had become a kind of scripture for those who believe that truth, however painful, is sacred. In the years that followed, readers continued to find the book. Some said it changed how they consumed true crime. Others said it changed how they thought about silence. Teachers used it to discuss empathy. Parents used it to teach caution without fear. Survivors used it to remind the world that their stories were more than headlines. One letter that Cain kept folded in her journal came from a reader in Kansas who had lost her son to violence. It read, "Your book didn't heal me, but it made me feel less alone. Maybe that's what healing really is." Cain would reread those words whenever she questioned why she kept returning to stories like Delphi's. They reminded her that storytelling, when done with care, could be an act of communion. The authors also found their own quiet transformations. Greenlee, once grounded in logic and law, began to speak about faith, not the religious kind, but the faith required to keep believing that telling the truth matters. Cain, who had always chased facts, learned to respect silence, to let pauses carry as much meaning as words. Some truths, she said, arrive as echoes. Delphi itself evolved into something like a pilgrimage site. People still came, not for spectacle, but for solace. They stood at the fence by the bridge, left flowers or notes, and walked away in silence. Some visitors prayed, others simply stared at the sky. Each person seemed to leave a piece of themselves there. Their fear, their guilt, their empathy. The place had absorbed it all and somehow transmuted it into gentleness. On the 7th anniversary, the families gathered once more. The town held a vigil at sunset, the kind that begins with tears but ends with a quiet kind of warmth. The mayor spoke briefly, thanking everyone who refused to let the story fade. "We are not defined by what was taken from us," he said. "We are defined by what we continue to give." When the crowd began to sing softly, a hymn not of religion but of remembrance, Cain and Greenlee joined in. The sound rose into the darkening air, mingling with the sound of the creek below the bridge. Lanterns floated upward, one by one, tiny suns against the indigo sky. And for a moment, Delphi glowed. That image would stay with them forever. The bridge, no longer just a crime scene, but a threshold between worlds, between grief and hope, between silence and song. Back in her apartment weeks later, Cain sat at her desk and wrote the final sentences of their afterword. She thought of Libby and Abby, of Becky and Áine, of the investigators, the town, the readers, the listeners. She thought of how stories never truly belong to their writers. They belong to the world that remembers them. And then she wrote, "The bridge still stands. So does the town. So do the people who believe that memory, not vengeance, is the answer to darkness. The creek still runs beneath it, soft as breath, carrying with it everything that cannot be said. Fear, faith, forgiveness. And when the wind moves through its frame, it doesn't sound like sorrow anymore. It sounds like prayer." Those were the last words of Shadow of the Bridge. In the years that followed, the world would move on, as it always does. But the echo of that prayer remained, in the hearts of readers, in classrooms and vigils, in quiet towns that now knew the cost of their own safety. It lingered like the hum of water under wood, the whisper of memory refusing to fade. Because in the end, Shadow of the Bridge was never just about Delphi. It was about all of us. The living, walking our fragile paths above unseen darkness, carrying light in our hands, trying always to cross. And though the shadow remains, so does the light. Always the light. For most people, the story of Delphi ended with the final page of Shadow of the Bridge. But for Áine, Cain and Kevin Greenlee, it never truly stopped. When you spend years living inside a tragedy, talking to its ghosts, walking its paths, memorizing its silences, the line between observer and participant begins to blur. The book was done, but the story remained lodged beneath their ribs, humming like an old wound that refused to close. After the publication, their lives moved forward in ways that looked normal from the outside. Cain took on new reporting projects, lectured at journalism conferences, mentored young writers who wanted to tell stories with integrity. Greenlee returned to his law practice, defending clients whose names would never make the news. Yet both of them carried Delphi in quiet ways, in the pauses between sentences, in the careful language they used when speaking of pain, in the nights when sleep wouldn't come. The darkness of Delphi had left an imprint. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something like reverence. They had come to understand that tragedy was not an event, but an atmosphere, one that never fully disperses. "We lived in that story for so long," Cain would say later, "that it started to live in us." At first, they tried to escape it. Greenlee buried himself in work. Cain tried to write about lighter subjects, art, travel, culture. But everything she wrote came out tinged with Delphi's shadow. Even when she covered unrelated crimes, her tone had changed. She couldn't unsee the quiet dignity of victims' families or the damage caused by careless headlines. "Delphi changed the way I write," she confessed in an interview. "It made me slower, gentler, less certain. For Greenlee, the change was philosophical. Before Delphi, he had believed in the law, its process, its structure, its promises. After Delphi, he began to see its frailty. The law wants clarity, he told a class of law students one spring. But human truth is never clear. It's layered, contradictory, sometimes unbearable. The job isn't to simplify it. The job is to hold it. The two stayed in touch constantly, exchanging notes and thoughts, sometimes late into the night. Their conversations often circled back to the same theme, how to live with what you know. Because once you've seen the cracks in the world, pretending they aren't there becomes impossible.
And yet you still have to live, still have to laugh.
Still have to find beauty in ordinary things. Cain wrote about that in her diary one night. You start to understand that the bridge isn't just a place in Delphi, it's the mind itself. The span between what we know and what we can bear. As the years passed, invitations continued to arrive. Universities wanted them to lecture on ethics. Journalists wanted interviews about the responsibility of the storyteller. But with every retelling, Cain felt the weight of the story deepen. It was as though speaking it again made it heavier. She began to question whether remembering endlessly could sometimes become its own form of imprisonment. One autumn afternoon, she and Greenlee met for coffee in Chicago, halfway between their cities. It had been months since they'd last spoken in person. The air smelled like rain, and the city hummed with ordinary life. Children, traffic, laughter. They sat in a corner booth, both quieter than usual. "You ever wish we hadn't gone so deep?" she asked. Greenlee thought for a moment. "If we hadn't," he said, "someone else would have." "Maybe less carefully," Cain nodded.
It's strange.
People think writing about darkness makes you darker, but sometimes it makes you softer. You realize how fragile everyone is. That fragility became the heart of their later reflections. In a world obsessed with spectacle, Delphi had forced them to rediscover tenderness, the kind that doesn't erase pain, but honors it. They began to see their work not as journalism, but as stewardship, a promise to hold the truth without exploiting it. Their public appearances changed too. They no longer presented Delphi as a case to be solved, but as a lesson about how to listen. They reminded audiences that every victim's story is a conversation between the living and the lost. "We tell their stories," Cain would say, "not to claim ownership, but to keep them in the world a little longer." In one particularly moving lecture,
A student asked, "What do you do when you can't stop thinking about a story?"
Cain paused before answering.
"You don't stop," she said.
"You learn to carry it better." That, she realized, was what Shadow of the Bridge had ultimately taught them. How to carry the unbearable without letting it consume you. Greenlee, ever pragmatic, compared it to the work of grief counselors.
"You can't heal anyone," he said. "You just show up and listen. That's what storytelling really is. Showing up." And they kept showing up. Not because they needed to, but because Delphi had taught them that silence helps no one.
The bridge, in all its rusted permanence, had become a reminder of endurance. It still stood because it refused to collapse, and in that refusal, it had become something holy. Cain once returned there alone on a foggy morning in late spring. She didn't bring a camera or a notebook. She just stood at the fence, watching mist curl around the iron beams. The sound of the creek was low and constant, like breathing. She felt neither fear nor sadness, only gratitude. Gratitude that the story had found its voice. Gratitude that the girls were remembered. Gratitude that light, no matter how dim, had survived the dark. When she returned to her car, she looked back one last time. The bridge, barely visible through the fog, looked almost weightless, as if it were floating above the earth between worlds. And in that moment she finally understood. Stories like this don't end. They dissolve into the people who carry them, into the silence between words, into the quiet insistence that remembering is a form of love. That night, she sent Greenlee a message. "We did what we were meant to. The rest belongs to memory." He replied simply, "Then let's make sure the memory stays kind." And that was how Shadow of the Bridge ended. Not with closure, but with care. Not with justice defined by verdicts, but with justice embodied in the way the living treat the dead. In a world that often mistakes noise for truth, Cain and Greenlee chose the opposite, to leave behind silence that speaks. The bridge still casts its shadow, but in its light, the tellers and the readers learned how to carry what remains. There comes a point in every story where the telling itself becomes part of the memory, where words are no longer about what happened, but about what remains. That was where Shadow of the Bridge eventually arrived. The murders of Libby German and Abby Williams would always be an open wound in the Heartland, but for Áine, Cain and Kevin Greenlee, the meaning of Delphi had shifted once more. It was no longer just a place of grief. It had become a compass pointing toward the fragile but stubborn endurance of the human spirit. Years after the first printing, long after the headlines had faded and the courtroom lights had dimmed, Cain sat alone in her apartment late one winter night. Her desk was littered with notes, fragments from readers, new research, half-formed thoughts for future essays. The world outside was quiet, snow soft against the window pane. On her shelf, a single copy of Shadow of the Bridge leaned between two stacks of unrelated books, its spine creased, its corners worn. She reached for it and ran her fingers along the cover. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to read it, not as a journalist, but as a witness. The words no longer felt like hers. They belonged to the people who had lived them. To Becky Patty, to Anna Williams, to the volunteers who had searched the woods in the February cold, to every reader who had whispered the girls' names like prayer. The book had become communal, transformed by the thousands of eyes that had read it and the countless hearts that had carried it forward. That was, she realized, the real purpose of testimony, to take private pain and make it shared, so that no one bears the full weight alone. Meanwhile, Greenlee was speaking at a legal symposium on the ethics of defense in high-profile crimes. When a young law student asked whether he ever felt guilt defending people accused of terrible things, he paused, thoughtful. "The law gives everyone a voice," he said. "But Delphi taught me something the law can't teach, that listening is sometimes a greater form of justice than speaking." He didn't mention the book by name. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew. As the years stretched on, the bridge itself aged, its wooden boards softening, its iron rust deepening to a dull red. The county debated restoring it, but no one could agree on what that restoration should mean. Some wanted to reopen it, to reclaim it from darkness. Others argued that leaving it closed preserved its sanctity. In the end, they compromised. A viewing platform was built nearby, where visitors could look across at the structure without setting foot upon it. From there, the bridge seemed both close and unreachable, a ghost of its former self, suspended above the whispering creek. Cain and Greenlee stood on that platform together during one of their last visits. They didn't speak at first. The air was cool, and the late afternoon light turned the world gold. In the distance, the bridge glowed softly, half swallowed by vines and half illuminated by the sun. "It looks peaceful now," Greenlee said. Cain nodded. "Maybe that's the point. It's not just a crime scene anymore."
"It's part of the landscape again. Do you think it should have been torn down?"
he asked. She thought about that for a moment, then shook her head.
"No, we need reminders."
Even the painful ones. They stood there a while longer, watching the light shift across the iron beams until the shadow of the bridge stretched across the water below. Cain took a photo, not for publication but for herself, a quiet, private proof that something broken could still be beautiful in its survival. That night, She wrote in her journal, "The bridge is still here, and so are we. That's all the justice the world can promise. Endurance." In time, Shadow of the Bridge came to be regarded as more than a book about Delphi. Critics and readers alike began to cite it as part of a new tradition in American non-fiction. Stories that reject spectacle in favor of reverence, that see violence not as entertainment but as an invitation to empathy. It joined the canon of works that redefined the true crime genre, transforming it from voyeurism into testimony. But for Cain and Greenlee, those accolades meant little. What mattered was what the book left behind. They saw it in the faces of students who vowed to write differently, in the letters from readers who spoke more gently, in the communities that learned to gather not around fear, but around memory. Delphi had taught them that tragedy could either fracture or forge, and that which it became depended on how people chose to remember. The final scene of Shadow of the Bridge was never meant to be cinematic. There were no confessions, no verdicts, no neat conclusions. Just two people standing before a rusted monument to everything fragile and everything enduring. But in that simplicity lay its power. The story refused to give closure, and in doing so it offered something truer: acceptance. Cain later described it best during a radio interview. "We built bridges to connect us, but Delphi reminded us that bridges also teach us balance. You can't cross safely if you forget where the gaps are." For the listeners who had followed the story from the beginning, that line felt like both warning and comfort. It meant that understanding darkness isn't about descending into it. It's about knowing how to keep your footing above it. As the years passed, new generations discovered the story. Some found it in classrooms, others in libraries, others late at night, on their screens when they couldn't sleep. Each reader took something different from it: caution, sorrow, strength. But all of them found themselves standing, in imagination, on that same bridge, looking out over the same quiet water, feeling the same mix of fear and grace. And that is the secret power of storytelling, that it allows people separated by time and place to meet, if only for a moment, in the same emotional space. In her last public essay on the subject, Cain wrote, "The bridge isn't just Delphi's, it belongs to everyone who's ever faced loss and chosen to keep walking anyway. It belongs to everyone who's looked into the dark and decided to light a candle instead." That was how Shadow of the Bridge ended, not with despair, but with devotion. For somewhere beyond the reach of headlines and verdicts, two young girls still walk in memory, their laughter carried by the creek, their footprints echoing softly on wood. The people who tell their story keep walking too, crossing and recrossing that same invisible span between remembrance and renewal. And above them all, the bridge stands, old, rusted, enduring, holding the weight of everything said and unsaid, everything lost and everything found. Because in the end, the bridge is not about where it leads. It is about the courage it takes to cross. There are stories that roar like thunder, shaking the world for a moment before fading into silence. And then there are stories like Delphi, quiet, persistent, echoing through the years like the low murmur of a river beneath a bridge. These are the stories that change not through shock, but through stillness, through the long, slow act of remembering. Shadow of the Bridge became one of those rare echoes, a whisper that refused to die. When Áine, Cain and Kevin Greenlee finally stepped away from the public eye, they did so with the kind of exhaustion that only long compassion brings. They didn't retire from journalism or law. They simply moved differently. They spoke more softly now, walked more slowly, carried conversations like fragile glass. Delphi had taught them that words, once spoken, live forever in the air, and that every retelling either honors or distorts the truth. They had spent years trying to make sure theirs honored it. In the years following their book, the nation's appetite for true crime changed shape. It didn't disappear, it never could, but it matured. There was less hunger for gore, more attention to empathy. Filmmakers began consulting trauma experts. Podcast hosts opened with disclaimers about compassion and consent. Documentaries began asking not what happened, but how do we heal from what happened? Cain and Greenlee saw these small shifts and knew that Delphi had left its fingerprint on the culture. The darkness of that bridge had taught the country something about the cost of curiosity. But for them, the most meaningful impact was personal. When Cain walked into classrooms now, she didn't teach the mechanics of reporting. She taught silence, how to listen when someone breaks it, how to hold that space without trying to fill it. Greenlee, meanwhile, mentored young defense attorneys, reminding them that justice isn't the same as victory. You'll lose sleep, he told them. That's how you know you're still human. Sometimes they still received letters from readers. One came from a retired police officer who said the book helped him understand why certain cases haunted him for decades. Another came from a survivor of assault who said she no longer felt invisible. And there were messages from strangers who had never known Delphi but carried it in their hearts as a symbol, not of horror, but of grace under grief. Every year on the anniversary of the murders, Cain lit the small candle that Becky Patty had given her years ago. Its glass edges were cracked now, its flames smaller, but it still burned. She would set it beside her window, the same way she had when she first wrote the book, watching its light tremble against the dark. It wasn't a ritual of mourning anymore. It was one of gratitude. For memory, for endurance, for the quiet faith that even the smallest light has weight. Greenlee had his own ritual. He kept a single pebble on his desk, smooth and grey, taken from the creek below the bridge. He never spoke of it, never explained it to visitors. It was simply there, a reminder of the ground beneath all stories. Sometimes, when his office grew too loud with paperwork and arguments, he'd touch it lightly and feel the cold of the water that once flowed over it. The bridge had left its mark on him too, not through sorrow, but through humility. And Delphi itself, the town at the center of it all, carried on. Its children grew up. Its main street brightened with new shops and murals. The trail reopened partially, lined with wildflowers that bloomed every spring. The bridge remained closed, still fenced, but visible from the new memorial park. People came quietly, stood for a moment, and left. No one spoke loudly there.
They didn't need to.
The air carried its own reverence. Every spring, the community held a gathering called the Day of Light. It wasn't an official holiday, just something people did. They met at dusk near the creek, lit candles, and walked together in silence toward the bridge. The crowd was small, a few hundred, maybe less, but the sight of those flames winding through the twilight had a kind of holiness to it. Among them were faces from nearby towns, sometimes strangers who had only read the book but felt drawn to honor what it represented. One year, Cain and Greenlee attended anonymously. No speeches, no interviews, just presence. They stood among the crowd as the wind moved softly through the grass, carrying the scent of the river and the sound of quiet breathing. When the candles were placed along the fence, the light reflected on the rusted iron beams like 1,000 tiny suns. Cain felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness but from recognition. The bridge, once a place of death, had become a place of devotion.
Memory had transformed it.
The shadow had become the frame that made the light visible. She leaned toward Greenlee and whispered, "This is what stories are supposed to do." He nodded. "They build bridges." They stayed until the last candle flickered out, until the stars appeared, and the night turned silver with their glow. When they finally walked back toward their car, Cain glanced over her shoulder one last time. The bridge was dark now, but she knew that the light remained in the people who carried it. Years later, when she finally stopped writing professionally, she left one sentence pinned above her desk. Some bridges are built from steel. Others are built from remembering. It was the final echo of everything she and Greenlee had learned, that the act of bearing witness is itself a kind of construction, an architecture of care. That storytelling, when done with grace, doesn't just preserve pain. It transforms it into connection. The bridge in Delphi will one day collapse. All things do. Time will rust its bolts, water will eat at its bones, and eventually it will return to the earth. But its shadow, the one cast across the Heartland, across the hearts of those who heard the story, will remain. Because some shadows don't signify darkness, they signify depth. In the end, that is what Shadow of the Bridge became. Not a monument to death, but to the stubborn, miraculous persistence of love. The love that remembers, the love that endures, the love that keeps crossing even when the path is uncertain, and as long as people tell the story, not for thrill, not for fame, but for the quiet truth of what it means to care. The bridge will never truly fall. It will live on in every act of empathy, in every whisper of remembrance, in every candle lit against the wind, because memory, like water, always finds its way forward. There are stories that end with answers. Delphi never did. It ended with echoes, quiet, unending, circling through time like wind between the iron beams of a forgotten bridge. For Áine, Cain, and Kevin Greenlee, those echoes became the measure of everything they had learned, that truth, when spoken gently, can outlive noise, and that the sound of memory is often softer than silence itself. Years had passed since the last candlelit vigil, and yet Delphi still breathed beneath the nation's consciousness. Sometimes it appeared in lectures, sometimes in late-night conversations, sometimes in a single phrase, "down the hill," that could still hush a room. But the tone had changed. What once was horror had become reverence. What once was fear had become reflection. The country no longer whispered the story to stay safe. It whispered to remember. Cain often said that the hardest part of writing Shadow of the Bridge wasn't confronting the darkness. It was learning how to stop speaking and start listening. When people grieve, she wrote later, they don't need brilliance. They need presence. That principle had followed her into every story since.
Even in the most mundane moments, a stranger's pause,
a mother's sigh, she heard Delphi humming quietly beneath the world, reminding her that compassion has its own frequency. Greenlee, meanwhile, returned to teaching. His lectures no longer centered on legal theory, but on ethics. You'll be tempted to see justice as a finish line, he told his students. It isn't. It's a practice, a way of staying awake. Whenever he mentioned Delphi, he did so sparingly with a kind of ritual respect. We failed them in some ways, he said once, but their story made us better listeners. And that's not nothing. Together they were invited to speak at a symposium on memory and justice in American storytelling. The hall was filled with journalists, artists, and families of victims from across the country. When it was their turn, Cain began not with data, but with sound. From the speakers came a recording, the quiet rush of the Deer Creek beneath the bridge, captured years earlier. For a moment the audience said nothing. Then Cain spoke. This is the truest part of the story. It's the sound that's still there when the rest of us are gone. That recording, just 2 minutes of moving water, became an unexpected symbol. Teachers played it in classrooms. Podcasters used it as background for episodes about empathy. Filmmakers layered it beneath closing credits. It wasn't dramatic or haunting. It was steady like breathing. And in that steadiness lay everything Delphi had come to mean: endurance, remembrance, quiet courage. The authors declined most interviews after that. They didn't want to be experts anymore. They wanted to be witnesses. When people wrote to thank them, they always responded the same way: thank you for remembering. It was all they ever wanted. Not fame, not closure, just continuity. Delphi itself settled into a new rhythm. Children who had been toddlers during the investigation were now teenagers, walking the same trails with earbuds and laughter. The bridge remained fenced, watched over, untouchable. But the trail that led to it was alive with footsteps again. The town had reclaimed its own story, one step at a time. Every February, the creek froze and melted again, repeating the same pattern that had always been there. Life went on, and in its repetition, it honored the unspoken contract between past and present, to keep remembering, not through monuments but through motion. One evening, Cain stood beside the water again. She was older now, her hair streaked with grey. The world had changed around her. New crimes, new headlines, new generations learning the language of empathy. And yet, when she closed her eyes, she could still hear the same sound, the water moving beneath the bridge, whispering the same refrain. She thought of Libby and Abby, of Becky and Áine, of every voice that had once filled the quiet. She thought of Greenlee's calm pragmatism, of the weight they had both carried, and she thought of how stories, when told with care, become prayers that don't need gods. "The water keeps moving," she whispered, and that was enough. Because that sound, that low, endless murmur, was the story's true ending.
Not the verdict, not the book, not even the bridge.
Just movement, just endurance, just life continuing, stubborn and luminous beneath the weight of memory. The world will forget details. It will forget names, dates, faces, but it will not forget the feeling. The bridge will collapse someday, yes, but the current beneath it will carry everything forward, into other creeks, other rivers, other hearts. That is the promise of remembrance. That is the meaning of testimony. So when the world grows loud again, when the next tragedy arrives, when headlines demand attention, there will still be, beneath all that noise, the sound of Delphi, a soft, unwavering reminder that compassion, once awakened, never truly sleeps. The water keeps moving, the memory keeps breathing, and somewhere, two girls still walk toward the light. The bridge still stands, its wood worn thin, its rails bent with rust, its silence heavier now. But beneath it, the water keeps moving, always. Carrying the voices, the prayers, the unanswered questions, downstream into the wide American quiet. Delphi is no longer the tragedy it once was. It is something gentler now, a hymn of endurance, a lesson in how love survives the dark. The people have grown older. The flowers return every spring, and the memory, that soft, unbreakable current, flows on. When night falls, the wind passes through the bridge, and the beams hum like a heartbeat. Listen closely and you can almost hear them. Two girls laughing just out of sight. They are not gone. They are the echo that made us listen. They are the shadow that taught us to see. And somewhere in the dark heart of America, the bridge keeps whispering, not of sorrow, but of remembrance, because the water never stops.
And neither do we.